So, a little while ago, I came across this video about Marxism by the legend himself, Steven Crowder. This video is going to be have to be split up into two parts, as Steven Crowder in this video shoots out a lot of incredibly fallacious and misleading points really fast. And in order to really dig into each one individually, which I intend on doing, would require an amount of time in one day, an amount of storage on my phone, which I don't really have to do that in one video. So this is going to be split up into two parts, in which I'm just going to essentially go over the points Steven Crowder makes individually, explain exactly where they're misleading and false, etc. So let's just get into it.
This one's by popular request because this Karl Marx video is a little old, but has enjoyed a second win specifically due to the Bernie Sanders supporters, as you will see in the comments section, despite the fact that they swear up and down socialism and communism have nothing to do with each other. Let's get to it.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet we're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx.
Straw man! Nobody dismisses him. Everybody who's read Karl Marx and understands economics doesn't like him. They're not dismissing him, they're listening to him saying, oh, you're an insane person, and deciding to go the other direction.
So the first assertion that he makes is that nobody who understands economics or is an economist is a Marxist. I mean, this is just pretty blatantly untrue. I mean, I can point to several Marxist economists. There's Richard Wolff, there's David Harvey, there's Hans Georg Backhaus, there's Paul Cockshott, etc. I mean, there is a very large number of Marxist economists in academia, right? This is kind of a baseless assertion. In fact, the branch of academia which economics falls under is disproportionately represented by Marxists. A 2006 American National Representative Survey of American professors found that about 17% of professors in the social sciences self-identify as Marxist. This is a proportion which is much higher than any other field of academia. Furthermore, perhaps the reason the majority of American economists aren't Marxist is because the economics which are taught in school, like the mandated high school programs and so on, are not Marxist economics. These are rational econ, pro-capitalist economics which are being taught in school. So yes, if the system, the school system, which produces these professors, is teaching pro-capitalist ideology, then yeah, of course, the majority of professors which come out of this system will not end up as Marxists, will end up as, some variant of pro-capitalist ideology. Moreover, this is a statement which completely disregards how base affects superstructure, right? So a core aspect of Marxian theory is that the base, the mode of production, gives rise to a superstructure, which is, everything from culture to education to psychiatry to prisons, basically every aspect of culture which seems independent of the mode of production, but really, upon further analysis, exists to maintain the mode of production. And, we can see this, I don't really feel like getting into it right now because this is a long enough video as it is, but, we can see this with the way prisons have developed throughout time to accommodate the mode of production, the same thing with psychiatry and even schools, etc. So the flaw that Crowder makes is that he assumes, well, we all just have, completely free will to choose whatever ideology we want, and the economists who know what they're talking about don't choose Marxism because it's just a worse ideology, which completely disregards the fact that these economists he's appealing to live in a society in which every institution that exists serves the mode of production. So his kind of assertion of a free will on the part of these academics to, just choose their ideology neutrally in accommodation with what they think is the best or the most logical is just not really consistent with Marxist theory, which Crowder clearly hasn't read any of. Furthermore, there have been several empirical studies which validate various Marxian theories. I mean, for example, the labor theory of value has been proven in academic peer-reviewed studies by Cockshott, Cottrell, and Michelson, 1995, Frolick, 2013, Sakurai, 2014, and Bobaeka and Ciccarelli in 2019. The theory of surplus value has been validated by several peer-reviewed economic studies as well, such as Wolfster 1973, Moroshima 1973, Lynch 1988, and Amsden 1981. And these are just a few examples. Like, for example, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall has been empirically observed by several other studies, Maito 2014, Besu 2010, etc. So his idea of like, oh, science just disagrees with Marxism, no. Like, if you actually look at it, many core Marxist theories have been empirically validated by economists, even if they aren't Marxists, and have found to be consistent with reality and economic law.
This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships. Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer.
Before we get to some details here, it's really important. This person is trying to present this as unbiased, but they're telling you that you ought to and should look to Karl Marx as a guide. They also say it has maybe been used for some bad regimes. Okay, let's flip that. Name me any good communist economies that have come. One. Let's start with one.
Crowder's next assertion is the good old communism has never worked. Name one place where communism has worked. This is an argument that we Marxists hear far too often, and it's really not a good argument, and here's why. So, when capitalism emerged out of feudalism, there were several examples of capitalist societies which failed before capitalism became the predominant system. I mean, there was France, which devolved into monarchy. There was northern Italian city-states. There were attempts at colonization, capitalist colonization from Spain and Portugal, which failed, etc. And the same is true for when feudalism emerged out of slave society. So what we see is that when feudalism emerges out of slave society, when capitalism emerges out of feudalism, every time a new epoch is developing, there are several examples of failed attempts, failed feudal societies, failed capitalist societies, before these systems succeed and become the predominant system. This is just how modes of production naturally develop throughout the course of history. This is not something, initial failure is not something that is specific to communism. And if failure in initial implementation meant unworkability, then we wouldn't be living under capitalism right now. And in fact, feudalism would have never developed out of slave society. We would still be living under slave society if this was a valid argument, if this was a sound logical deduction. But it's not, which is why we've seen these different epochs, despite multiple failures in initial implementation, evolve out of each other time and time again. Furthermore, what we see under a real historical analysis is that the reason these revolutions have failed so many times, the reason they continue to fail, is not because of the inherent unworkability or failures or theoretical unsoundness of the ideas of communism or socialism, but rather because of the inevitable degeneration of the revolution, which comes when a revolution is isolated. So, when a revolution is isolated to, say, one country or a few countries for a variety of reasons, such as the necessity that a country compete in the international marketplace to be successful, among many, many other things, which I have an entire essay on, my point is that when a revolution is isolated, it is doomed to degeneration. And so what we see is that these revolutions happen when they're not part of a broader international revolutionary wave, and then these revolutions are therefore doomed to this sort of degeneration. And so the failure of these revolutions is not indicative of the failure of communism or the unworkability of communism, but rather it is evidence of the theoretical flaws of the theory of socialism in one country, which is a much more specific and historically accurate critique, which is not applicable to a broader critique of communism or socialism. Furthermore, while I do posit that, socialism or communism has never been achieved, we have seen for hundreds of years people maintaining in their villages and in their communities and in their cities key components of socialism. I mean, we can see this in medieval times, in Western Europe in the 1800s, in the Netherlands in the early 1900s, even in many barbarian societies. What we see is many societies throughout history, hundreds of them, maintaining key aspects of socialism, such as communal ownership of land, distribution based on need, communal ownership over the means of production, many aspects of socialized production, etc. So what we see is that, again, I wouldn't say that these are socialist societies, but we see is that communism or socialism, or the concepts of communism and socialism, has shown themselves to be economically plausible, to be consistent with our quote-unquote human nature. And where and when, these societies have been destroyed, these villages have been destroyed, they weren't destroyed by their own internal contradictions. They were destroyed by external pressure, by other invading villages, and so on. And so we see very clearly that what we have here is a system which has shown itself historically to be, economically plausible, consistent with human nature, which has, like every other epoch, like capitalism, which Crowder advocates for, has failed a few times in initial implementation, which we've seen that these failures are the result of a very specific theoretical flaw of a specific Marxist theory, that being socialism in one country, rather than these failures being indicative of a broader issue of socialism or communism itself. And so my trying to figure out how Crowder and all of these neocons can honestly look at history, at Marxist theory to any extent, and extrapolate the failure of these quote-unquote socialist nations to this argument that, well, look, socialism failed, it can never work, it's unworkable. Like, this is just a very, very historically and theoretically ignorant argument to make. It's also worth noting how Crowder displays his ignorance by even asking the question, name one country where socialism or communism has worked. If Crowder knew literally anything about Marxist theory, he would know that socialism and communism, by the Marxist definition, are both inherently international epochs, not a mode of production which can just be implemented in one country or shown to work in, one nation, right? This just shows his theoretical misunderstanding of the very thing he's trying to debunk in this absolutely hysterical video.
Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property.
First up, how does anyone watch this, hear that, and not literally soil themselves? Abolition of private property. The thing you're watching this on, it's not yours. It belongs to this bearded guy.
So, in throwing this outrage of oh, look, communists want to take your phone or your TV or your toothbrush, Crowder again shows us his stunning ignorance of Marxism, which he's trying to critique in this video. If Crowder knew even the basics of Marxism, he would know that by abolish private property, we don't mean we're going to collectivize your toothbrush. We don't mean people are not going to be able to own things, right? There is a distinction between personal property and private property that Marx made extensively clear. Private property refers to the means of production. Personal property refers to, your phone, your toothbrush, whatever, your house. In abolish private property, what Marx meant and what Marxists mean is that one person can't own a factory or can't own the means of production as a means to exploit those under him. This is a thing that's not allowed under socialism or communism. That's all abolish private property means, right? And deliberately conflating personal property with private property, Crowder displays either his ignorance of basic Marxian concepts or his disingenuousness and his willingness to trick his audience and be directly deliberately misleading in order to make his arguments.
He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels.
Also a prick.
Modern work is alienated. One of Marx's greatest insights is that work can be one of the sources of our greatest joys. But in order to be fulfilled at work, Marx wrote that workers need to see themselves in the objects they have created. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labour offers us a chance to externalise what's good inside us.
So right off the bat, let's break this down, using their example. Simple one, a chair. It was made by workers. That feels good. You made a chair. But what does it not account for? Innovation, creativity, risk, advancement, progress.
So Crowder just made a lot of really bad arguments really fast. And I think he did it deliberately really fast, because if you look at the things he listed that work under communism doesn't account for, 3 of like the 5 things that he said are innovation, advancement, and progress. These are the same thing. Like, he just said the same thing with a different word 3 times in order to make his point look like bigger and more coherent. Like, can we just acknowledge that for a second? Okay, but putting that aside, let's look over the coherency of this argument. So, the argument is communism couldn't cause innovation. There's no reason that this is the case, right? Like, while the profit motive is one cause for innovation, is one reason for innovation, it's not the only motive. It's not the only incentive. And furthermore, it is an incentive which suppresses other incentives actively. Like, by placing all the focus on profit, people are less likely to maybe innovate for the community because they're personally interested in it, etc. And so, while yes, the profit motive is one incentive, it's not the only incentive, and it's an incentive which suppresses other incentives. Therefore, we have reason to believe that in the absence of this incentive, in the absence of the profit motive as an incentive, other incentives which the profit motive currently subdues would rise up and become more prominent and do its job in a way which doesn't necessitate that communism lead to slower rates of innovation. This is a sort of argument that we communists hear all the time. If there's no profit incentive, if there's no profit motive, why are people going to work under communism? Why are people going to innovate under communism? What incentive do they have? What reason do they have to do this? The truth is, people work all the time for reasons unrelated to profit, for things they're not getting compensated for monetarily. Take cleaning your house, for example. I mean, I think that, I've cleaned my house in the past month. I'm sure most of you have as well. Did you do it because you were getting paid for it? No, you did it because you feel responsible for your house. Now, you can say, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean we're going to do work for a community or for a broader society because we don't feel responsible for our community. And that's 100% true under capitalism. Capitalism, through the very specific mechanism of alienation, which is implicit to capitalism, alienates us from our work and from our communities, from ourselves and from our families. Marx talked extensively about why this is. However, once this alienation, which is specific to capitalism, erodes along with the erosion of capitalism, once the selfishness which is incentivized under capitalism and promoted under capitalism erodes, we will begin to feel more responsible for our communities and more likely to innovate or do work for that reason because of the abolition of the very specific mechanism of alienation which prevents us from doing this and keeps us from doing this in the modern day. And furthermore, I don't even have to appeal to theory, because this argument that the profit motive isn't needed to innovate can be seen empirically, can be seen through peer-reviewed reputable studies. For example, a Harvard Business Review study found that innovations from people who give them away and often don't profit from them at all increasingly compete with patent-protected for-profit innovation in many parts of the economy. And the conclusion of the researchers, the people conducting the study, which was peer-reviewed, very reputable, was that yes, the profit motive is not needed to innovate, and is not needed to innovate to an extent which couldn't exist without the profit motive. So this argument that Crowder's making, that he made 3 times, has no empirical basis and has no theoretical basis and is just demonstrably false. And another thing Crowder listed that this quote-unquote doesn't account for, whatever that means, is creativity. I mean, wasn't the whole point of the argument that the video he's responding to made, under communism, people are alienated from their work and therefore can model their work after them and can express themselves through their work? Isn't that creativity? Crowder responding to a video explaining correctly how under communism, because of the lack of alienation, creativity is encouraged more in one's work. Crowder responding to that by saying, well, yeah, but work under communism doesn't account for creativity, with no further explanation, just literally means nothing. This means nothing. Work under communism doesn't account for risk. Innovation doesn't account for risk. What does that even mean? The very concept of risk only makes sense. It's the risk of failing in the context of a market. It only makes sense in the context of a market. Communism abolishes markets, so yeah, risk wouldn't really exist under communism. This is, again, meaningless. This doesn't mean anything. I don't know what he's trying to say. It doesn't account for risk? Yeah, I mean, there's no risk because there's no markets under communism.
This is why, and I'll prove this as a recurring theme, outside of some weapons created by government, no communist regimes or countries have been at the forefront of giant leaps in technology or innovation. Those gifts have never been given to the world through communism.
Okay, so you can't claim that leaps in innovation have never been contributed by communism, because communism has never existed. Communism, by its Marxian definition, is an international epoch which abolishes the state, which abolishes class, which abolishes commodity production. None of this has ever happened. This is objectively, definitionally never been achieved, because it's an epoch, right? And it's not something that can be achieved in one country. It is an epoch. I don't know how Crowder doesn't understand these very basic concepts. It just doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, even if you're going to say that these nations like the USSR or, are communist, then you still can't make the argument Crowder just made. Because, he says, oh, these places have never been at the forefront of innovation. That's not true. The USSR, when they implemented what Crowder is implying, what Crowder implies is socialism or communism, they went from a backwards, almost completely illiterate third world nation to an industrialized powerhouse, to the first country to go into space. Right? You can't say that communism doesn't lead to innovation, and we can see this empirically, because we can't see the results of communism empirically, because communism has never been tried. And even if it has been tried, and I were to grant you that premise, then it has been at the forefront of innovation, because the Soviet Union innovated very, very fast. And before you say, well, it's just because, the technology already existed in the West, the Soviet Union's innovation did not slow to any extent once it had caught up with Western technology. So, every level of the argument Crowder is trying to make is just not true. It's just completely nonsensical. Also, of course, capitalism has contributed more innovation than communism. Capitalism is the prevailing global economic system, whereas communism is still in the phase where this has not been achieved yet, and it has not become the prevailing global economic system. They're not comparable. They're not on equal footing, and we can say capitalism is better because it's led to more innovation. Capitalism and communism are different epochs in completely different stages of development. This argument is extremely disingenuous. It's not at all a good comparison to make. It doesn't make the argument that Crowder is trying to make.
Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialised. Specialised jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity. Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are, and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence.
Here's the crux of Marxism. Karl Marx and people who forward this focus entirely on the worker, specifically the labor worker. Here's the thing, the labor worker is not a synonym for humanity. Humanity as a whole also needs medicine, progress and efficiency, agricultural innovation, needs for humanity that cannot be met if the mere labor worker's importance is placed above all else.
So Crowder's argument that communism only focuses on the worker is just completely false. Communism inherently advocates for the abolition of the very concept of the worker, of work. Like, that's why communists often say abolish work. And no, what they mean by that isn't abolish people doing work. It means abolish, work is characterized under capitalism as a necessity to survive, etc. So, like, this argument is just baseless. It's just a complete misrepresentation of Marxist theory. Communism is not just the liberation of the worker. It's the liberation of all of humanity. I mean, Marx even talked about how the bourgeoisie in very abstract ways suffer from capitalism. So to say that, oh, it's just about the worker, it's just not true. It's not, this just has no basis. Furthermore, communism is not just good for the worker. It's beneficial to humanity as a whole, as it liberates us from the mechanisms of the capitalist mode of production, which lead increasingly to almost insurmountable existential threats. For example, the infinite expansion of capital leading to crippling imperialism, to resource depletion and the prospect of mass starvation, to climate change, etc., etc., etc. So all of these things are byproducts of the capitalist system, are existential threats, are not just, minute suffering which occurs through alienation or exploitation inflicted upon the worker. These are existential threats which threaten the whole of humanity, which communism liberates us from in the abolition of the mechanisms which produce these problems. So, this assumption of like, oh, all communism does is help out the workers. It doesn't help like the whole of humanity. That's just not true. Like, he completely ignores the extent to which the byproducts of capitalism lead to like these increasingly dangerous issues. By eliminating the distorting lens of the profit motive, communism allows us to address the existential threats which threaten us today in a direct and proportional manner, whereas under capitalism, we don't address many things which should be addressed because it wouldn't be profitable, such as climate change. So from the perspective of the well-being of humanity as a whole, rather than just the immediate well-being of the worker, even denying the fact that it's the mechanisms of capital which create these problems in the first place, communism still allows to address these problems in a more efficient way, and is therefore good for humanity as a whole, even if you do disregard the fact that it's things like the infinite expansion of capital which lead to like climate change and increasingly dangerous imperialist conflict. So Crowder also throws out a bunch of like really loaded, meaningless arguments like, well, communism couldn't give us medicine or progress or advancement or any of that. And my question is why? Communism isn't a set structure. Communism is the negation of capitalist relations. Communism could take a plethora of forms. So essentially, the argument that Stephen Crowder is making is communism can't give us medicine or innovation or progress because it's not capitalism, which I shouldn't even have to go into how many logical fallacies that argument commits. It's just literally meaningless. And again, if his assertion is that, well, if you place all of the importance on the labor worker, you can't meet the broader needs of humanity, my response is that's just a straw man of communism. Communism in Marx, no Marxist, not Marx, not anyone who like seriously reads Marx, no communist, says that the goal of communism is to actualize the immediate well-being of the labor worker. The goal of communism is to meet the needs of humanity in a more direct, proportional, and efficient way. like this argument of like, oh, it only focuses on the worker, so it can't meet the broader needs of humanity, is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what Marxism is and what communism is.
Work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology.
Here's where the wordplay is so important from the unbelievably biased presenter. They've now referred to workers as utterly expendable under a capitalist system. No, in a free enterprise system, your value is determined precisely by your contributing power, your skill sets, and your work ethic. You're the best engineer in the world? You're paid your worth. Under communism, you're not. Your contribution is worth the exact same as the guy next to you on the factory line who has no interest in contributing at all.
I just stare at my desk, but it looks like I'm working.
So while jobs may be legally barred from being deemed dispensable, guess what? Everything that makes you uniquely valuable as a human being is. It's entirely dispensable. You're a number.
Crowder just said that a worker is not expendable under capitalism because their value is based off of how much they contribute to the goal of profit. The very definition of expendable is insignificant in comparison to an overall goal. And Crowder just demonstrated that the worker's value is based off of the overall goal of obtaining profit. When a worker cannot make as much profit for an employer as, say, a robot or an immigrant, then they are cast aside. They no longer have a job. So therefore, the livelihood of the worker is insignificant compared to the overall goal of profit. So yeah, under capitalism, workers are by definition expendable, by the basic definition. And Crowder literally just made this argument himself. He just debunked himself. Like, I don't even know how it's possible to like, if I tried, I could not be as blatantly, like, ignorant of the very concepts I'm trying to discuss as Stephen Crowder is. To say under communism you're worth as much as everyone else, you're expendable because you earn as much wealth for your work as the guy next to you. To say that is to conflate monetary wealth and money to someone's value in society, to somebody's worth as a person, which is a concept which communists fundamentally reject. He's saying, well, because your worth is based on how much money you earn, and under communism, people earn the same amount of, not money because money is abolished under communism, but the same amount of resources for work. That means everybody is just as valuable under communism, so everybody is expendable. Which, no, because while communists do advocate for the abolition of allocating resources based on like work output or whatever rather than need. While Marxists do advocate for mostly like equal distribution or distribution based on need, at least the whole from each according to their ability to each according to their need slogan. Marxists don't just want to abolish that; they also want to abolish the social standard that one's worth as a person should be based off of the amount of stuff they make from their work. So he's applying a concept to communism, which communism would fundamentally abolish, and therefore this is a really bad argument, which like completely strawmans his opposition. Furthermore, this premise isn't even true that everybody gets the same amount of stuff necessarily for their work. I mean, Marx, in many of his works, including the Critique of the Gotha Program, advocated for what he called labor vouchers in lower phase communism, which is just a system where you can access more goods for more work through this system of labor vouchers, while things are still largely distributed based on need. So this argument of like, oh, inherently under communism everybody earns the same amount of stuff, this isn't even a valid premise. Like, this is not consistent with the writings of Marx or Marxian theory, because clearly under lower communism this isn't the case. Furthermore, I like how in this part of the video Crowder appeals to like this hardline definition of higher phase communism in order to make his argument. Whereas if we're going to go by this definition, the countries he appeals to is like, oh, look, communism can't work because it didn't work in these countries. None of these countries, North Korea, the USSR, the China, etc., fit this definition of communism that Crowder just used to make his argument, where, like, you know, resources are distributed completely based on need, etc. I mean, surely in, like, the North Korea and the USSR and China, etc., there are massive disparities in wealth. You know, not everybody gets paid the same. So pick one, Crowder. Has communism never been achieved, or is communism bad because it inherently necessitates everybody get the same amount of stuff from their work? You can't make either of these arguments, and both of them are flawed, even if you were going to make both of these arguments. But these arguments inherently contradict each other. So Crowder is deliberately changing his definition of communism throughout the video to make different arguments against it. This is very disingenuous. I don't see how anybody cannot see through how Crowder is being deliberately dishonest here.
Yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out.
Oh, see, that sounds nice, right? Place in the world's heart. But what he just expressed is exactly why communism lends itself to mass murdering authoritarian regimes so perfect. You will pay your bourgeois.
Come here, I kill you. You come here, where's my time?
Can't believe it. Communism can only prey on fear and insecurity. Can capitalism? Sure, but it can only work if it simultaneously highlights the human desire to succeed, to progress, and to grow. Communism can only even be attempted with a scared and broken people. Capitalism, free enterprise, is most effectively embraced by optimistic ones.
It is true that revolutions often happen out of fear or negative emotions. However, this isn't, well, and this is because, you know, revolutions obviously arise out of poor conditions. However, this isn't specific to or a critique of communism. Crowder is a capitalist. Did capitalism not emerge out of revolution? Out of the negative emotions, out of the fear of the people whose livelihoods were being crushed by feudalism? Like, if this, the revolution happens out of people's fear, out of people's negative emotion, is a valid argument against emotive production, Crowder cannot sit here and in the same breath advocate for capitalism, which emerged out of the exact same means, out of these exact same emotions. And if Crowder is referring maybe not to the emotions which the revolution arises out of, but rather the emotions which the functionality of the system itself plays on, I would argue that capitalism functions a lot more so on fear. Under capitalism, if you don't work, you will, like, starve. You will, like, die. Like, you can't not work. Under communism, there's no fear that if you don't participate in the economic system, you're going to die because everybody has their basic necessities met because distribution is based on need. So I don't really understand this argument, right? Like, like capitalism 100% utilizes fear and uses fear to threaten people into participating in the economic system, much more so than communism does. Then Crowder says, well, capitalism can operate on the basis of fear, but it also requires that it highlights the human desire to progress and to advance. But he hasn't demonstrated in what way the implementation of communism would destroy the human desire to advance and progress. Like there's literally no reason that this desire to progress and advance would go away under communism, right? Like, and again, we found that, again, like, the profit motive is not needed to innovate, is not needed to work. I mean, if you want to talk about, like, work, look at, like, UBI, where and when UBI has been implemented, people don't need to work to survive, yet the rate at which people worked did not go down at all in Canada or in Finland or in any of these places. So, like, we see that the profit motive is not needed for this desire to, you know, drive or advance or succeed, right? So there's literally no reason why under communism, this would go away. The only thing which goes away under communism, is not the desire to advance or progress or succeed, it's the profit motive. And as I've showed several times throughout this video, and as can be seen empirically, the profit motive is not inextricably linked to any of these things. It's not inextricably linked to the desire to advance or succeed or progress. And even if these things were specific to the profit motive, I could just as easily look at communism and say, well, look, communism can prey on fear, but it can only work if it utilizes or highlights the human capacity for mutual aid, which is specific to communism, which is utilized under communism in a way which it isn't utilized under capitalism. So you see, like, this argument Crowder's trying to make is literally meaningless. Like, it means nothing. This is such a bad argument.
Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the labourers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce.
So, Karl Marx thinks that profit is theft. You know what he doesn't think is theft? Actual theft.
I got robbed by a sweet old lady on a motorized cart. I didn't even see it coming.
Example, I invent the light bulb. I've toiled away, creating thousands of failed prototypes, investing some of the best years of my life while other people ate, slept, and enjoyed life.
Maybe we spent a little too much time puking off balconies. We had fun, huh?
Finally, I create a successful one, and it improves and saves billions of lives across the world. All because of an ingenious idea and work ethic. People across the world are willing to pay for my wonderful invention, and so I become wealthy. That's capitalism. According to Marxists, that's theft. Same situation. I invent the light bulb, only government comes in and takes all of my profit at gunpoint. According to Marxists, that's not theft. Are you getting it yet?
So next, Steven Crowder makes this conflation of like, capitalism is an exploitation because I invent something and people choose to buy it, and where's the exploitation in that? And this is, the same conflation I saw Charlie Kirk make in the video in which I responded to Charlie Kirk talking about Marxism, somehow more coherently than Steven Crowder even, but that fundamentally misunderstands and conflates where Marxists believe the exploitation kicks in. The Marxists don't think that the exploitation kicks in when you make something people want and people choose to buy it. Marxists claim that the exploitation kicks in where the thing that you invented is mass-produced in factories, and the owners of these factories extract the surplus value of their workers in an inherently involuntary transaction. So now I have to explain why surplus value is extracted and why this is an involuntary transaction. So for one, surplus value is extracted because under capitalism, the cost of all goods are based around the cost of production. The cost of production represents the equilibrium which supply and demand cause prices to oscillate around. However, at equilibrium, there has to be some way in which profit is generated. So how is profit generated at equilibrium? Well, the only rational explanation is from the extraction of the surplus value of the worker, which means the worker works a certain amount of hours, and at a certain amount of hours, that worker starts working hours which are not paid for. That is what extraction of surplus value means. The worker is producing more than they are being compensated for. This is inherently exploitation. And this is involuntary because in order for a transaction to be voluntary, there has to be a reasonable alternative. If I go and point a gun to somebody's head and say, give me your money or I'll kill you, them giving me their money is not a voluntary transaction because there is not a reasonable alternative to giving me the money, because the only alternative is getting shot in the head, which isn't reasonable. The same thing, the same principle can be applied to wage labor. Wage labor or starve, which is the dichotomy under capitalism. Either you work or you don't get paid and you starve, is an involuntary transaction because starving is not an alternative, a reasonable alternative to wage labor. So therefore, yes, while, Steven Crowder tries to make this, weird conflation of, oh, look at, they're trying to say that the exploitation happens because people want to buy things that they like, and I get money off of it. No, the exploitation happens, and you cannot argue this. This is not arguable. Exploitation does happen through the extraction of the surplus value of a worker who is engaged in an involuntary relationship. This is just definitionally exploitation. Also, here Crowder once again displays his fundamental misunderstanding of what communism is. Communism is not the government taking your money from you. That's not what communism is. Under communism, the government doesn't exist. The state doesn't exist. There is no coercion under communism. Under communism, all work is completely voluntary and directly social, meaning you are voluntarily choosing to work directly for the community, directly to meet the needs of humanity rather than to meet the profit of an employer. So, there is no coercion involved. There's not even a coercive structure capable of carrying out this act that Crowder is implying, right? He just completely is strawmanning the communist position in order to make it sound spooky scary. I really don't understand how somebody can make an entire video about Marxism without understanding the very, very fundamentals of communist philosophy or Marxist philosophy. It's genuinely mind-blowing for me.
At the end of the day, it comes down to men with guns forcing you to give them your stuff.
Be a good little fella now and open the door.
So you wonder why not only communism lends itself to authoritarian regimes, but why leftism lends itself to more violent, disruptive protests like Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. It's because despite what hippies and democratic socialists tell you, at its core, communism and socialism, through its only available methods of collection and distribution, are predicated on the use of violent force.
The next assertion is two-pronged. One, he says that socialist or communist regimes always devolve into authoritarianism, and this is why the left is so violent. Both the claim that socialism and communist revolutions always devolve into authoritarianism and the claim that the left is violent are just not true. They're just empirically not true. These are just completely meaningless statements that Crowder has made. So for one, no, not all communist or socialist revolutions have devolved into authoritarianism. For example, we can look at the Paris Commune, the Free Socialist Republic of Germany, the Free Territory, Revolutionary Catalonia, etc., all of which, devolved and collapsed because of the inevitability of the degeneration of a revolution in isolation. But none of these places devolved into authoritarianism or a dictatorship or any of these things, right? Also, it's by no means true that the left is just super violent, at least not nearly as violent as the right, which Crowder is a part of. So, for example, the ALDCE reports that the right wing is responsible for 74% of politically motivated attacks or crimes, while the left wing accounts for 2%. So this claim of the left is a violent mob, look at this video on an iPhone or on Twitter. This is videos that Crowder sees on Twitter and makes a huge deal out of on his show. Look, the right wing is being attacked by Antifa. These are no means indicative of broader social trends. And when you look at broader social trends, the right wing is incredibly more violent than the left is. This is just a fact. This has been seen across so many studies. I mean, look at the recent mosque shooting, which was carried out by a white supremacist. It seems like all of these big terror attacks are carried out by right-wingers. Meanwhile, Crowder wants to make a huge deal over the fact that one dude got punched at an Antifa protest. He completely disregards the bigger picture and focuses on these little micro-incidences because they confirm his narrative. And this is a very disingenuous tactic that he's using. So, that's about half of the video. That's about half of Crowder's video. I think I'm going to stop there because, one, I don't have that much storage on my phone on which I'm recording this. Two, I don't have that much time to, you know, go into every single point he makes throughout the entire video. And three, I legitimately think I'm going to rip my hair out if I don't stop this right now. Because, oh my god, Crowder is insanely disingenuous and insanely ignorant, and it genuinely hurts me that he has like 4 million subscribers on YouTube. So, yeah, I'll continue this. I'll dig into the second half of Crowder's video, probably tomorrow.